Looks like we don't have too much on the agenda for this month's December 2020 OpenZFS leadership meeting. Start with just a few announcements, updates on projects we've been discussing. So OpenZFS 2.0 was released. Congratulations to everyone who worked on it, and thanks. I haven't seen any major issues or problems come up with it, so that's great. And then we also saw DRAID integrated to master, so that's great. Brian, if you're on, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on the next release. I don't see him. All right, well, we can check with him next time. I think we had discussed trying to have a 2.1 release relatively soon that would include DRAID, which would be kind of an exception to our usual policy of not including major features in updates in minor releases. But I think he had some motivations for doing that. So
I think
find out.
he was interested in maybe direct.io if it was ready as well, being part of 2.1.
All right. I saw some emails fly by on that, but I haven't caught up on what's going on with direct.io.
Also, I don't know in what group it was discussed, but with FreeBSD 13 branch in winter and release in March, it would be good if 12.1 could be released or 2.1 could be released somewhere in winter. Then we could integrate it.
Okay.
Yeah, we had a FreeBSD call with Brian about that last week, and it sounds like we're going to try to get all that sorted out in time to line up nicely with the FreeBSD release.
Cool.
Which months are you calling winter?
So yes, our release is in March, so we'd like it to happen before that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think technically winter is basically January, February, March in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's like borderline.
Well, even technically, but that's December 21st to March 21st or something, right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. Cool. We'll put it on the agenda next time to get an update from Brian on that. And then the only other item I had on the agenda was the forced export review. Alan.
Yeah, so Brian had gone over and pointed out a couple of minor things, and Will updated that over the weekend. And it'd be great if people could look at that. I know earlier today, Brian linked an older ZOL issue to it of people running into the problem of if your pool gets suspended because the VDEV's gone away because it was a USB stick or it's a hard drive that's just gone and never coming back or whatever, that currently the only way out of that is to reboot and not have the pool imported anymore. But with the forced export code, we're able to actually, while throwing away the dirty data, unwind everything else about the pool. And importantly, if you have a second or third or other pools running, they can continue to move forward. Whereas if the unlucky pool happens to suspend while holding things like the namespace lock, then you can't even run ZFS list until you deal with the suspended pool. And that, degrades the user experience.
Yes, that'll be definitely a nice usability improvement.
Yeah, so it's working. We have a bunch of test cases, but if people have ideas for other test cases or could take a look at it or try it out, that'd be good.
Cool. All right, that reaches the end of the scheduled agenda. What other things would folks like to discuss?
Have you made any more progress on the RAIDZ expansion stuff?
Just a little bit since our last meeting. So it's pretty close to being fully functional. There are some known issues with like if you crash at the wrong time or if devices become degraded. like you lose a disk while you're in the middle of the expansion, that we still need to address. But aside from those corner cases, it basically totally works. It's pretty slow in some for some things, but those are all things that we know how to address, and we're working on them. So if folks want to do more testing on that, that'd be great. I was planning to get out like an alpha, I guess the current one is an alpha release. I was planning to put out like a beta by the end of the year that would just draw more attention to the fact that we made all this progress. But yeah, it should work. So the latest things that we've done are getting it so that after you do the expansion, the writes are happening with the new data to parity ratio, which means that it takes up less space on disk, and also the performance is better. You get basically the normal performance rather than when you're reading or writing things that are like misaligned, then it has to generate a lot more ZIOs. There's actually some work that what I'm working on right now is splitting out some of the performance work to integrate separately. So you'll see a review for that soon. And what I'm doing is one of the big problems after you do the expansion, when you're doing a read and you're reading a block that was written from before the expansion, then it's like kind of going diagonally across the disks, because you have like, if it was allocated originally as 4 wide and now you have 5 disks, then like the parity is every sector, the parity is changing to a different disk rather than like the parity all being on one disk for that given block. So the way we deal with that is by creating a bunch of ZIOs, like one for each sector essentially, and then like stitching it all back together, which works great and integrates well with the existing code. But just like allocating and deallocating all of those ZIOTs and even all of the ABDTs associated with them is very slow. Like it uses a lot of CPU to do that, because you're talking about like for 128K IO, let's say, if the layout matches the logical and physical layouts match, then you're only dividing that 128K into 5 disks, so you have like 5 ZIOs, versus the worst case is like you have a 128K IO and you have A shift 9, then you have like 256 ZIOs and ABDs that you're allocating, which is it just takes a lot more CPU.
Go
ahead, Alex.
And that will remain with pool forever. So I'm just worrying, will it be usable after that for more than home system with a couple disks, or 3 are extended to 4 or whatever? Like how bad it is? Have you done at least any test benchmarks?
Yeah, I've done a bunch of benchmarking on that, and we have a bunch of work in progress that's like kind of rough and ready quality, but it works and it improves the performance to be pretty good. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it was like more than half the normal performance. So it wasn't like all the way to normal performance, but it was pretty close. And this is like I think a system with like 8 CPUs driving, I forget how many, driving a bunch of SSDs. So the throwing more CPUs at it would improve things further. So the work I'm breaking out right now is basically being able to like pre-allocate the ABDT, have that embedded in another data structure. And so like when you're creating an ABD that's just like referencing another one, then you can provide the actual ABD struct that'll initialize in that way. That way you don't have to do the KML-malloc for the ABDT itself.
But ABDT is OS specific, so it has to know then about FreeBSD and Linux differences. On FreeBSD, ABDT also includes list of pages, so it's variable size.
Yeah,
so it also has to be.
Yeah, that's all handled. I mean, this type of ABD is just the one that references another one. So we aren't like setting up any pages. There isn't any like memory that's actually exclusive for that ABD, because like to improve the performance that I mentioned, basically what we do instead is we do the aggregation at the RAIDZ level, so that instead of creating one ZIO for each 512 bytes or each A shift, we create one ZIO for each disk, just like we did before. And then, but we still want to use the existing like RAIDZ parity generation reconstruction logic. So we need ABDs that point into each sector of that, and those are the ones that I'm talking about, like pre-allocating. So with the new way of doing it, you only have like the number of disks, number of ZIOs, and you have a lot of ABDs, but with this change that I'll be upstreaming soon, they're very, very lightweight.
Okay, yeah, we'll see. Still 50% sounds scary for me, but maybe for somebody who less centered on performance could be useful.
I'll look up the numbers too, and I can get you the real number.
Speaking of ABD, unrelated
and
to
that was with A shift 9 also. So like,
of course. So
your customers are probably using A shift 12
at least.
Yeah. So that means like the overhead is 1/8 of what I was measuring there.
No, even in production, we have right now one case we are investigating, and they have performance problems and CPU usage going about 50% on quite decent hardware. And there we have something like a 16K RAIDZ on top of 5 wide, or 16K ZVols on top of 5 wide RAIDZ. So even chunking at 4 or 8K is pretty significant. It significantly increases number of IOs overhead. So even that is not great.
Yeah, but you should get, with RAIDZ expansion, you should still get better performance than what you're talking about, as long as you have large block size, because of the like integrated aggregation at the RAIDZ level. So you won't be doing ZIOs for every 4K. You'll only be doing the ZIO, for that whole block.
So you're saying those 512 or 4K are not pushed to VDEV queue? They handle it somewhere inside?
Exactly, yeah. So we aren't actually generating ZIOs for each sector. We're only creating one ZIO for the whole disk.
That's much
block.
Better. But...
Yeah, so that's the big one, because I mean, like ZIOs are way higher overhead than ABDs even. So without that change, you're talking about like 1/10 of the performance with A shift 9. So.
Oh yeah, that sounds better. Just it's been a while since I looked on expansion code last time. I don't remember it was there at the time, at least.
That code is, that's new. It's in a PR against the expansion code. It's not in the main expansion code yet. So that's why you haven't seen it. If I recall correctly, with the 4K sector size, the performance of those reads was like very close to without the expansion. It was like, you're paying for the one extra ZIO because you have to read from all the disks, not just the ones that have the data, right? Because all the, if you have like a 5 wide RAIDZ 1, normally a read would just be reading from 4 of the disks. But if post expansion, you have to read from all 5 of the disks because they all have data and parity.
And drop holes or read and then ignore or something like that.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of overhead, but I think that with records with 4K sector size, it was pretty minimal, like less than 10% overhead. That was of overall performance with the 8 CPUs. I'm sure that the CPU usage is higher. So there's still some more, stuff to be measured there, I think, for your use case.
Well, I still don't think in real production we'll add disks often. It's happen on top of VDEVs, RAIDZ groups, whatever. But yeah, some small home users could potentially use it.
Yeah, and I think you're right to be concerned with the performance of reading those old blocks post-expansion, and that's why we've been doing some work in that area. There's also work to be done in the performance of the expansion itself, which is very slow now because it's doing it sector at a time, like creating ISIO for every sector. I'm not sure if we will get to addressing that before integration. But since that's kind of a temporary thing, like, oh, your expansion takes a long time, you know.
Well, if it goes in
Better than
the
not being able to do
ground
that at
and
all.
doesn't affect much
Exactly.
payload, maybe it's acceptable.
Yeah.
Are you going to integrate it to 2.1 or it's?
No, I don't think that it's. I mean, I would like to make that time frame, but I think it'll be done when it's done.
I see. Since we don't have other things, I have one quick FreeBSD question. Does anybody know why we have tunable for ABD block size? Because obviously setting it less than page size makes no any sense, since it automatically drops to smaller blocks even needed. And setting it higher is just a killer for VM subsystem for UMA caches. It's just much more expensive.
That originally went back to Sean Chittenden and Groupon, but yes, I agree. I don't think it makes any sense.
I just recently hit it and saw we're doing 64-bit division for every ABD creation. That's expensive, and I see no any point. Shift by 12 would look much better to me.
Yeah.
And that's not mentioning other potential use cases of page aligned code that I think would be interesting to not with that to do some kind of ABD magic on geom VDEV geom layer, so that we could skip some copying and write directly from ABD.
Yeah, that would be good too. So I definitely think that sysdetail could go away, or, you know, if it needed to stay, could at least be changed units into the bits to shift instead of a number, so we don't have to do the division.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's actually useful.
Thanks.
But I had a similar question, actually. I was looking at kind of, well, I don't know if it's actually a regression, but a user reported after upgrading to OpenZFS 2.0 on FreeBSD that the .zfs directory doesn't work the same as it used to, specifically in a jail. So when I looked in the code in the ZFS control directory stuff, when you go into .zfs/snapshots on FreeBSD, there is a comment that this is nasty, and then it changes the thread credentials to the kcred, to the basically roots credentials, and then does the mount and then switches it back to the original credentials. So that a regular user could access the .zfs/snapshot directory, whereas normally users can't mount, and if you enable user mount, there's a requirement that the user has to own the directory they're mounting to, and obviously the user doesn't own .zfs/snapshot/ the name of the snapshot.
Mm-hmm.
Some recent cleanup changed the in global zone macro to use curproc instead of curthread. So that code would need to be updated to fake the credentials of the process instead of the thread. But the question is it okay to do that? It's how FreeBSD has always done it, it seems. But does it make sense to allow regular users to be able to mount snapshots and especially do that from inside of a jail?
Does FreeBSD have the notion of like delegating data sets to a jail?
Yes, it does. And then they could mount it normally there. I don't actually know how the .ZFS stuff responds when it's a delegated data set. In this particular user's use case, the data set is mounted on the host and just happens to be inside the CH root that the jail is based on. So the jail itself doesn't have visibility on that data set. Like it can't ZFS list the data set that it's ending up mounting.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look on Illumos for what it does for zones, or actually, the other thing, because my initial thought would be is if it's delegated, then yeah, it should work. But if it's just, a subdirectory of a data set, it's maybe a little different. But I can't remember now. It's one of those things where you just never think about it.
Yeah, I never thought about how, a user in a jail being able to access .ZFS snapshot worked. Or the fact that nothing ever seems to unmount those. They get mounted with the ignore flag, so the regular mount command doesn't display them, but if you do mount-v, you can see the list of them. And it also came up because, while testing this, I broke SNMP on one of our servers because when there were over 1,000 snapshots mounted, the UDP buffer wasn't big enough to send back the list of all the data of all the file systems on the machine.
I just tested in what it looks like, at least on SmartOS. I'll need to test OmniOS just to make sure it wasn't something that was customized. I don't think so. But yeah, it looks like only if the root of the data set is in the zone does the .ZFS work. But if you just for example, if just part of the data set's visible into the zone, it doesn't seem to. So, I mean, just as a data.
In this case, the whole data set is inside the zone CH root. Like its mount point is inside the CH root, but the data set is not delegated to the jail. And so the .ZFS is visible. It's just because the credential hack isn't working right now, if you go in there and try to, you can ls and see the list of snapshots, but if you do ls-l, you can't actually fstat the directory because you don't have permission. Basically because it fails to mount it when it tries to mount it to get the fstat. And I was just wondering if the right approach was to fix the credential cheat or to do something different.
Is there much else we can do different?
Other than say, permission denied. Basically, my thought was, is this expected behavior? Then we should fix it. And if it's not, should we hide it behind a sysctl so that only people that need it turn it on?
No, I don't know what. I'm sorry, I just want to say that while we're not using jails, delegation to jails, we're using previous versions of files for Samba. So
right, and that's accessed by a regular user. And even if you had user mount on, they wouldn't be able to mount a snapshot because they don't own the directory. So it seems like it's pretty required at this point. Yeah,
I'm sure. When you said it got broken, because we haven't noticed problem.
I think it's only in master. I think it was October, maybe.
If it's in master, maybe that's when why we haven't seen it. I mean, FreeBSD had.
I don't know if it's in head yet. But it was you guys that broke it by fixing something else.
Me, us, we.
Yeah, well, I think it was Ryan. Made the changes for the in global zone to be able to not go through 2 functions and 3 macros to find out which jail you're in. A much more direct route, and it looks much nicer. It's just the hack only fakes the credentials for the thread, not the whole process, and now we examine the credentials of the process.
In terms of how it should work, I think that the .ZFS snapshots directories work over NFS.
Yes.
So it makes sense that it should also work locally without having any special permissions by default, whether that's delegated into a zone or in the global zone as a non-privileged user or whatever.
Yeah, I think that it seems to make sense. And yeah, like you said, NFS and the Samba use case are both pretty big.
Yeah.
So then, yeah, I will post the patch to change the credential hacking to make it work again. Great,
Cool.
thank you.
By the way, Alexander, I looked up the numbers and I was getting 85% of the normal performance with all the performance improvements for the reading post expansion. And that's with the record, with the 512 byte sector size. So that's probably a worst case.
Yeah, even if it's 85% of performance, not of spent CPU, that's not as terrible, especially it's for the worst case. I hope it will.
Yeah.
No, I same as I always discourage people from removing VDEVs unless they really need it. I guess I'll still remain discouraged from resize, but it's good to have it even really need it.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. What other topics do we have to discuss today? None? All right. So our next meeting is scheduled for January 5th, and it will be the earlier time. I'll make sure that's noted on the calendar. Then earlier time, 9 o'clock Pacific. Have a great winter holidays, everyone, and we'll see you in the new year.
Happy holidays. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.